today, everyone, there's been about 15 people that have said, oh, Tom's going to talk about that later. So we're going to be here till 6:30. I hope that's okay with everybody. I just wanted to talk briefly about some work that we're doing looking at scaling up. I think the stuff that Matt talked about and some of the students and those hydrodynamic processes like right at the interface between fish and screens are really important. But it's also really important that we have our eyes on the horizon and have a strategic sort of idea of where we're trying to head. If we look at sites like this that are massive, it's a pretty obvious priority. You can see might not be able to see, but there's a person just here flying the drone just for scale. So this is a massive site that takes about 340 Olympic swimming pools a day. Across these 11 pumps, and you can see that some of them are missing. So there's 1, 2, 3 that are out of the water at the moment. And this is because they're getting impacted by debris. So they're getting clogged with sticks, branches, all that kind of stuff. And the farmers need to take them out and service them. So at any one time, they've got 3, 4, 5, 6 of these pumps out of action so that they can get refitted with the same technology that wasn't working in the first place. So this is not an ideal solution. Putting these are the fish tails that people have been talking about, these trash racks, refitting new versions of the same old garbage. And essentially what I say to the guys is that they're effectively running underwater wood chippers. And you put a big log like that through a prop and you're going to be causing some damage. So they're looking at $500,000 to $600,000 a year at this site in maintenance. Which is pretty crazy. So some of those sites that are large like that, it's an obvious priority. You go, we can save a lot of fish, we can save a lot of money. What do we do about some of these smaller sites in terms of potentially screening them and trying to understand where we should be focusing our attention? Because the benefits to these individual water users can be significant. They might not be pumping that much water, but they might also be running at relatively fine profit margins. And we have had some pretty good success stories at sites that are relatively small like this, where we can put a screen on for $10,000 and that farmer might be able to, thinking of one specific case study, he's now able to cut the hay on his fields 3 or 4 times a season instead of once or twice. And so if he has a $10,000 screen, he's making $100,000 profit or revenue in that first year. So it's effectively paying for itself very, very quickly, which gets into the economic work that Boyd was talking about. But it's not just pumps, it is these channel systems, and like Boise mentioned, back in the late 1800s, that whole area around Mildura was developed. And the Chaffee brothers put steam-driven pumps to pump water 25 metres out of the Murray, up over the bank and into 30,000 acres of these hand and horse-drawn channels, dug them out with horse-drawn carts. And we think our jobs are hard, but I can't imagine how hard that would have been. But those systems have become more modernised over the last 136 or 37 odd years. This is the Colliambally irrigation system on the, down in the Southern Basin. And, we have these automated gates and stuff, but we still have this problem of fish deaths. So this is an article from July this year of a native fish rescue in that area. And like Boise mentioned, from a departmental point of view, when we look across the state, what's the scale of this impact at that population level? And we can estimate those things and we need to do a lot more work on that. But we also need to think strategically about how we're going to address this issue and where can we focus our attention and efforts. So this was something that we talked about in a recent paper in Marine and Freshwater Research, where we reviewed the progress to date and we looked at priorities. And we really concluded by saying that action is required to identify the high priority diversions, to improve the affordability of screening, to encourage that industry stewardship, and to pursue advancements, those ongoing advancements in terms of that technical detail. And that action, affordability, acceptance, and advancements really forms the basis of a project that I've been working on, which is writing a New South Wales diversion screening strategy. And we've really been given a pretty fortuitous position where we can kind of choose our own adventure, and that strategy can be whatever we want it to be. So that brings us into trying to think about what are we going to really include in that? So what we've done to date is we reviewed the progress to date across Australia as best we can. We've been looking at the coastal zone. So we've done some stakeholder engagement on the north coast, on the Clarence and Richmond in New South Wales, and then further down south in the Bega-Brogo, and then some preliminary kind of investigations in the Hunter Valley, and then also in the Sydney metro area. And then we've been looking at this whole issue of prioritisation, which I'm going to talk a bit more about, and then ultimately early next year delivering a strategy, which may not have all the answers, but hopefully can set us on a direction of finding these high benefit, high feasibility and low cost sites where we can focus our energy and attention. But the question is, how do we separate those from these low benefit, high cost, low feasibility sites? And some of those are fairly obvious, but when you're dealing with, like sort of 10,000 sites, how do you actually kind of deal with that? There have been some efforts or attempts to prioritise sites for screening, diversion screening. So Alison King and her colleagues in 2020 had a go at doing this for gravity-fed diversions in Victoria. So there are 23 gravity-fed diversions, and they scored around 64 species due to their, according to their vulnerability, based on their conservation status and so on. But because they didn't have a lot of data on the actual volumes of water that were used, all the fish communities at each of the sites, they're only able to prioritise 9 of those 23 sites. And so if you're not actually prioritising those remaining sites, are you actually prioritising? And this is sort of what, you get into the weeds of this. When I wrote the project proposal, I was like, yeah, we're just going to prioritise all the sites. And then I got into the sort of detail of actually, okay, well, scientifically, how are we going to do that? And as Michael talked about, there's been some efforts in Queensland to do this, and that's really getting into this fine-scale detail of this high-resolution data and detail on where the pump is and how it's oriented in the channel and so on. And these efforts, unfortunately, and this isn't a criticism of these guys who've really done some great work, but there's some common mistakes that happen in conservation priority setting, and this is something I came across when I was teaching the Masters of Conservation Biology program at UNSW, teaching students how to design national park reserve systems using a quantitative approach. And one of those is that when you apply scoring and you say, okay, we're going to give this a 3 and this a 2, is a 3 150% worse than a 2, and so on. So there's these sort of inherent value judgments that we're incorporating into this. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we do need to be aware that these, explicit that these are the things that we're doing. So Tim Marsden had a crack at sort of addressing this in a recent paper, looking at resource deficient settings. And so this was in Myanmar. How do we prioritise barriers there? And this went from a high-level GIS analysis all the way through to then you go and do field assessments and then you look at the socioeconomic context. And so it incorporates trying to balance some pragmatism with some scientific rigour, and it's kind of getting that balance right that's really the challenge in this whole pace. So we've sort of taken an approach. I was hoping that we'd be further along. Everyone blames COVID, but actually we were going to run this expert elicitation workshop 2 weeks ago, and the facilitator unfortunately got COVID, and so we weren't able to do it. But we sent out a pre-workshop survey to the participants, and we said, what criteria could be used to prioritise diversions, and how confident are you in those, and what type of evidence is there to support that? And there was a whole list of criteria that came back, about 100 different criteria. But when we kind of grouped them up, they really focused around, this is the number of times they were mentioned by participants, the diversion characteristics, which Michael mentioned, are really significant in terms of those dynamics of how fish are actually entrained. The conservation setting, like whether there's threatened species there, that type of thing, but also their place in the river network. So like Matt Gordos is here, he's worked a lot on fish passage and prioritisation there. If you have a pump that's immediately upstream or say downstream from a weir and fish are accumulating there because there's no fish passage, then that may be a higher priority than another site. Socioeconomic factors and the cost and feasibility. But what's interesting here, I think, is that people are saying, well, these ecologists mainly and scientists and river managers are saying, what they're saying here through these data is that let's find the places where we're going to get the most ecological benefit, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it later. And because we want to set these ecological priorities, and then we'll deal with that later. But we can start to look at the patterns of water use across the different catchments. And if we zoom in onto the Macquarie, so the Macquarie River flows north through Dubbo, and that area at the top, that little accumulation of blobs, is where the Macquarie River screening program has actually been implemented. And without a actual prioritisation framework, what's happened there is that implicitly we've gone for the biggest diversions. So in this area, the top 15 of the 120 water diversions use about 80% of the water. And so these are the ones that we've actually gone ahead and screened. So the dark ones are already screened, the lighter green are going to be screened, the red one is unfortunately a site that was just impossible to screen. But in that system, by the end of 2026, we'll have screened 71% of the diverted water downstream from Dubbo. So the cumulative benefit of that is significant. If we look at the lifetime of the infrastructure over 50 years, and this is just a broad brush approach, don't crucify me, okay? But we've got the cumulative native fish impacted in the millions in an unscreened scenario over 50 years, and then we can look at the reduction in that impact by the screens that have already been installed and are going to be installed over the next couple of years. And so over that period, you're looking at ballpark 350 million native fish protected over 50 years. So when we're stocking 4 or 5 million native fish in New South Wales every year, it's a significant contribution to the conservation efforts. Now, we do need to do, this is a knowledge gap, population dynamics, fish maybe not going to live for 50 years, obviously. So very briefly, what we can do is we can look at those patterns of water use and we can then set our implementation approaches based on that. So we go, okay, we might want to here use an approach like we've done in the Macquarie, where we have this pattern of water use, and we say, go to the water user associations and say, can you help us, identify sites, who's pumping, who's not, what's feasible, what's not. They know the area, they get that buy-in and that participatory approach. At a place like this is indicative of the Hunter, where you've got one diversion that takes 80% of the diverted water. From a comms and engagement perspective, you need to get that comms and engagement right, or you lose that opportunity to protect 80% of the fish that are being impacted by diversion. And then contrastingly, in a site like down in the Bega Brogo, where you've got a higher number of diversions which all take relatively similar amounts of water and they're all smaller, you might just say, okay, well, they're all pretty much the same priority, so we're going to use an open expression of interest and approach there, and whoever's keen can screen. Are you keen to screen? There's a new thing for it. Write that down, Boise. So I guess just to sum up, this New South Wales diversion screening strategy is an opportunity for us to set a pathway that could help implement some of the policies in New South Wales. So screening's been written into policies, like the water strategy and so on. But how do we actually do that? That's the question that we have to answer. And so creating a prioritisation approach that does balance this rigour that the guys have talked about, but also has this element of pragmatism, is something that we're really hoping to achieve. And ultimately, it's not necessarily about saying this is number 6 and this is number 7 and this is number 8, but it's about, as a community of practitioners, targeting our attention, our effort and our investment on the sites where we can get best bang for buck, and we can balance those public versus private outcomes in an appropriate way, and ultimately to deliver those benefits for New South Wales and beyond. So if you want to have a look at some of those papers, there's some QR codes, or you can check out the Fish Screens website, where we're continuing to update stuff and try to keep it as up to date as we can. And I'd also just like to finish by saying thank you very much for coming today. It's pretty amazing. As a screen junkie, it's been a really good opportunity to learn a lot and to, just to see a community come together and, move things forward. So thank you very much, everybody.